Margaret Walker Alexander has had a long, distinguished, and varied career. She won the Yale Younger Poets Prize, wrote a biography of Richard Wright, and taught for many years at Jackson State in Mississippi. But she's best known for her epic novel, Jubilee, which follows a black family through several generations of hard times. Born in Alabama and raised in Mississippi, Miss Alexander is herself the product of a remarkable family.
Your parents, both of your parents, were very well educated.
My father took a master's in biblical literature from the biblical school that was connected with Northwestern. And my mother attended Northwestern's music school. My sister had a great desire to go there to school, but she wasn't old enough. She was only 15 when she graduated from high school, and she had to be 16 in order to enter that music school. And I went to Northwestern only 2 years, but I graduated at the end of those 2 years.
Well, you, like your parents, have pursued education to its limits. You have all the college degrees.
My father wanted me to become a scholar, and he thought that I could be. At one time, he thought I would be fortunate enough to go to abroad to study, that I could go to England and study at Cambridge. I didn't get to Cambridge, but I did get up to Yale, which he thought was just as good. And I was very fortunate then that I attended Iowa and Northwestern and Yale.
As a young woman, your first successful published literary ventures were in poetry. And I mean, you had some remarkable early success with Poetry magazine in the 1930s, and then finally the first black woman to win the Yale Younger Poets Award. There must have been difficulties. What was it like to be young and a woman and a poet and a black poet and get yourself published in these remarkable places? What were the problems then?
Well, one of the problems was the racist problem that has existed in publishing. It still exists. I think a white man can get published more easily than a white woman. A white woman can publish more easily than a black man. That a black man publishes more easily than a black woman. At the bottom of the heap is the black woman. She is the worst off of all concern, and she gets the least consideration.
One of the tricks, maybe tricks isn't the right word, one of the things that can happen that's so advantageous for young poets, young women especially maybe, is to have a mentor. I mean, for example, we all know that Zora Neale Hurston had a remarkable mentor in Franz Boas, and I understand that you also had 2 or 3 people along the way who were enormously helpful to you.
Yes, I remember Northwestern when I think of my favorite teacher there. Edward Buell Hungerford was my teacher in creative writing, and he did so much for me. He turned out to be a lifelong friend. He died a few weeks ago. His daughter wrote me a letter when he died, saying how much he loved me, and she knew he would want me to know he was gone.
And at Iowa as well.
Iowa, Paul Engel was my great friend, and Paul was the person who found a way to keep you there even though you didn't have any money. I didn't have any money. And he said, "Didn't you say your father was a preacher?" I said, "Yes." He said, "We just go to the church." And he did go to the Methodist church, and I borrowed money from the Methodist church to support me for that year at Iowa. So that I must say that these men believed in me, and they did things for me to help me after I was out of college.
You were working on Jubilee if I'm not mistaken, the Jubilee project is a project that lasts more than 20 years.
I started when I was 19 at Northwestern in my senior year. And I didn't finish it until I was getting my doctorate at Iowa just before I was 50 years old, which meant that from age 19 through 49, that's those 30 years, I struggled with Jubilee.
Yeah. It's, as now millions of readers know, it's a story, it is a Civil War, pre-Civil War, Civil War, and Reconstruction story. Family goes through at least 3 generations in Georgia and Alabama. But the remarkable thing about it is that it's all told from the point of view, more or less, of a maturing black woman. She was an ancestor of yours, is that right?
That's my great-grandmother.
And does some of this, a lot of the novel I know is imagined, but some of it comes from actual stories that you heard?
My grandmother told me, yes.
When you were how old?
Oh, I think she must have started when I could have been as young as 5 years of age. She started telling me this story as a bedtime story when I was a very little girl. And as I grew up and realized it was an important story, I began to question her more about it into my adolescence. And she lived with us until I was an adult. Therefore, I constantly asked her questions.
Yeah, but you supplemented this oral inheritance of yours with a phenomenal amount of reading and research.
10 years of research.
How can you describe that research? What kinds of things did you read?
Well, one thing was the Southern collection at Chapel Hill. I went to Chapel Hill and spent weeks there working on it. I went to Durham and read the slave narratives in the library at North Carolina College. I read all the history books I could find. I read the novels. There are 504 novels in Robert Lively's fiction, Fights the Civil War. And I read most of those novels, looking for my story, which I never did find.
You made up the story.
Not entirely. It is an imagined story, but it is also a true story. My grandmother said when my father used to question it, that it was just a tall tale. She said she wasn't imagining it. She was telling me the naked truth. That was the truth as she knew the story.
The main character, Viry.
Yes.
When I read about the novel Jubilee, it seems to me that one of the things that commentators return to over and over is the lack of bitterness finally in that protagonist. As every reader of the novel knows, awful things happen to her and her family.
She suffered a great deal of outrage.
Yes.
And we wonder how she did this without bitterness.
Yes.
And the only way I can explain it is that she was raised that way. That was the way my grandmother thought, and my mother was raised that way, and I was raised that way.
In the essays of James Baldwin, Notes of a Native Son, More Notes of a Native Son, The Fire Next Time, such essays as those, he often talks about the terrible effect that bitterness has on the person who suffers the bitterness. That is, that if you hate, it affects you. Is that was James Baldwin at all an influence on your thinking?
I don't think I thought of James Baldwin when I was writing Jubilee too much. Mm-hmm. I do agree with him that violence affects everybody involved. It hurts the people who are violated against, and it hurts the person who does the violence.
When one reads Jubilee, I mean, I was not raised in Georgia or Alabama. And would you tell me that that historically speaking, the food, the furniture, the language. I mean, how much accuracy are you after there?
Well, I really tried very hard to research everything, and when I was having my oral examination in Iowa, one of the teachers said, "I see where you have tin cans on the wedding, following the wedding. Did you do any research on tin cans?" And as funny as it sounds, at that time I had done the research on tin cans.
No, one does have the impression that after reading Jubilee, that you could live successfully in the 1870s because you would understand it pretty well. The novel, inevitably, that people talk about when they talk about Jubilee, they can't seem to stay away from it, and so I guess I can't either, is the other great Georgia pre-war, Civil War Reconstruction novel, Gone with the Wind. They're not the same book, but people want to talk about them together. How do you differentiate your book from the Margaret Mitchell book?
Frankly, I find several things in Margaret Mitchell's book that I disagree with. First of all, I think she has a romantic conception of the South at the time, and I think she develops a romantic concept of the South. And I think there are certain passages in Gone with the Wind that would have been better if they had been left out. There are long passages and historical parts that don't add to the story. And I think she could have very easily done away with some of those parts. I do agree that we are dealing with the same place, with the same people, and with the same community, that we are dealing with some of the same expressions, some of the same local feelings are there. That I was dealing with Southwest Georgia, and she was not very far from there in the area that she wrote Gone with the Wind.
Would you agree that the crucial distinction, though, in a sense, is that she's viewing this thing from the top down?
And I'm looking from the bottom up.
Yeah. And a crucial distinction, I think. Gone with the Wind made a enormously popular movie.
Yes, it did.
Has Jubilee been made into a movie?
No, Jubilee has not been made into a movie.
And why is that?
And partly because of books like Gone with the Wind. The feeling is that it would take a great deal of money and a great deal of time to create a movie out of Jubilee, such as you had with Gone with the Wind. It demands a great deal of your attention, it demands money, and it demands a lot of things that we didn't have.
Well, the novel will be reissued soon.
It'll be reissued soon. I don't know that we're going to have any better luck with it. We are very fortunate in some respects. Oprah Winfrey has mentioned Jubilee in the September issue of Life magazine. And what she says there is so wonderful that anybody reading that would think right away they may consider it as a movie.
Has it never been optioned even?
Oh, no.
No? I'm really surprised.
People have been interested, but they didn't have the money.
After winning the Yale Prize and then later getting a PhD in English at Iowa, you could have worked in any number of colleges and universities, but you chose to return to the South and Jackson State in particular. Why'd you do that?
I went back there for several reasons. The state of Mississippi loaned me the money that I used to go to school. The first 2 years I had a sabbatical, but the 3rd year I borrowed the entire amount of money. Any day I didn't go back there, I would have to return that money. I would have had to go somewhere else and work for that money. And I felt obligated to go back because I promised to go back. The people needed me there, and I owed the money.
Well, you stayed for 30 years, from 1949
I stayed there 30 years. I lived in Jackson, and I still live in Jackson. I cannot express my feeling about the Black Historic College. My father and my mother went to those schools. My grandparents went to that school. My children have gone to those schools, and my grandchildren. And although they've also gone to other schools, those are the schools that we feel obligated to. And to this day, I feel if I have anything, I owe them.
This just occurs to me this very moment, in fact, but are you friends, acquainted with Eudora Welty?
Eudora Welty is a personal friend.
I thought that must be the case.
It is true.
Yes, you two have lived in Jackson for
many years
40
together.
years.
And I've known her about 30 good years. And our friendship has gone that long. We met first in a committee meeting trying to get public television into Mississippi. And we were on the same committee. So we occasionally meet at parties. We occasionally met at certain social groups, and we got to know each other. She is a very wonderful lady. I like her very much.
Yes, it makes perfect sense that you two would
She's a great writer and a wonderful person.
Absolutely. Well, another very distinguished writer who was a close personal friend of yours for several years was Richard Wright.
Richard Wright was so close that people made the mistake of thinking that there was a romantic attachment. There was no romantic attachment. But we were good friends. For one thing, Wright could tell you a great deal about economics about economics and politics, and he had a very definite idea of the problems that black people face all over the South. Largely, he looked at them as labor problems.
Well, his primary interest was economics.
Oh, he was very interested in that.
Economics, even though for a period of several years you knew socially and professionally a lot of people in Chicago who were either dedicated leftists or outright communists, this never had any appeal for you.
Well, I think this is very hard to understand this, but there's such a thing. If you are, as I am, a member of the black race, you look around at them and see people. And Wright was what I call an unbeliever, and I'm a believer. And that's the big difference between us. And the things he talked about, he believed that. But I didn't believe those same things.
When I read these accounts of your friendship and then the end of your friendship with Richard Wright, everybody is very mysterious about it. What do you know now? Is it clear in your mind now what kind of a misunderstanding there was?
There was a great misunderstanding, and it was not a question of somebody I sought to marry. He would have been a mistake to marry him. I would never have married a man believing as he believed, not believing. The man I married was very much like me. And we lived together 37 years in marriage. We have 4 children, and I have now 9 grandchildren, and I even have some great-grandchildren. That's because the man I chose had the same, shall I say, moral ideas that I had, some of the same idealism that I had. He was not like Wright at all.
Let's talk about your poetry for a few minutes.
Yes.
One of the things that strikes me strongest is the sense of southern landscape, the southern countryside.
That's where my images are. That's where I get these images. You see them in every poem I wrote. In Southern Song and Sorrow Home, in Delta, in all of the poetry that I have, you see these southern images. And they come from the images of my childhood. I grew up with these images, the pine trees and the world around, the spring growth of wild onion. It is something that I lived with.
One of the stories that has circulated about your professional life for years is the controversy with Alex Haley.
Oh, yes.
Alex Haley is, of course, enormously famous and became quite prosperous for writing Roots.
Well,
What was your relationship to that?
I don't think he was nearly as prosperous as people thought he was.
Oh.
I don't think he had nearly the money that they thought he had. When he died, the money that people thought he had, it turned out he didn't have enough to pay the debts. And he didn't even really have enough to take care of the funeral expenses. So he didn't have the money.
Ah.
He really didn't have the money. How well he's thought of is another thing. Many people, black and white, don't think of him as a racist or as a plagiarist. I regard him as a plagiarist.
What did he do?
I think he took 400 pages out of Jubilee and put it over in a book called Roots.
Specifically, because many people know Roots from the television series,
yeah.
if not from the
And they don't
writing.
think that the books are similar, but they are similar in many ways.
Mm-hmm. And
The
did you take this
plot-
to court?
We went to court, the district court and appellate court. In both cases, I was the winner. I won, well, let's say it this way. I found myself in court where two people were concerned. Richard Wright's wife sued me for copyright infringement on her husband's books. And it turned out that I had not stolen anything from him.
Uh-huh.
The judges gave Alex Haley the benefit of the doubt. They said that they did not find what he had done.
Finally.
Finally, they did not agree with me in that. And so I found myself with two men having gone to court with both of them. I went to court first with Haley and then with Wright.
You went to court with Richard Wright himself, or with the estate?
His widow.
What was that issue?
Her issue was that she didn't give me permission to use all of his stuff, and that I had used things that she didn't give permission for me to use. That was not true. What I had been published and had been used by people all over the world.
Well, wasn't Alex Haley sued by other people besides yourself?
Oh yes, he was sued six or eight times.
All for Roots.
All for Roots.
Well, there's a lot of smoke there.
There's so much smoke, there must be some fire.
Very likely. Mm-hmm. Are you writing your autobiography?
I started it.
How's it going?
I did my father, my mother, and my early education, and then I stopped. I'm not satisfied with what I have. I will have to do a lot more work on it. The idea that I have of goodbye to liberalism is an important part, and I haven't done it. I have to do that.
But this is an ongoing project.
Yes, it's part of it's really what I do all the time. And in writing that story, I find myself also writing a lot about the idea of race in the country and how it affects us, how it has affected me, how it continues to affect me. But I hope if I live long enough to finish it up.
On the next Bookmark, we'll speak with Winston Groom, the creator of one of the most memorable characters in recent fiction, Forrest Gump. But Gump is only a small part of this prolific and imaginative writer's body of work. I'll see you then.